Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Peacock Sex. We continue our adventure here. So hopefully you'll subscribe and find this of interest. Continuing to talk about topics that affect the sexes, and that since our knowledge of the sexes is at such a minimal level, you can't help but discover new things about the sexes. Uh, this We're going to talk about the lessons of Titanic, the lessons of the sinking. Some of them. It's not uh, nautical engineering is not going to be one of the lessons. Um, but now, just to refresh your memory of what happened on the night of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, began to sink, began to take on water. There were 2,224 passengers on board, men, women, children, as well as crew members of both sexes. And 1,500 people died out of the 2,200 or so people on board, 1,500 dead. Um, now, the there were 20 lifeboats on board. If filled to capacity, they could have carried 1,178 people. So they still wouldn't have not been enough to evacuate the entire ship. I don't think the lifeboats were designed, it hadn't been anticipated that they would have to, at the same time, get everyone off the ship. They were sort of meant to ferry passengers from a stricken ship that could happen because of engine failure. And then you could take your time, ferry passengers one boat or a couple boats at a time to another ship. They weren't really intended to take everybody on board at the same time. And um, added to that fact is some of the lifeboats went down half empty, which should not have been done. That was a mistake, you know. Now, an interesting thing happened is um, many more men died that night than women, not just numerically, not just raw numbers, but on a percentage basis. Many more men died. Now, let me see if I have my, yeah, 75% of the women aboard survived. Only 20% of the men survived. Um, Nearly all the female crew survived. Almost all the male crew perished. Now, as you'll even remember from the movie, I was wondering, female crew? Yeah, they were maids, cooks, things like that. They weren't operating the ship, as you know from the movie. But nearly all the female crew survived, whereas almost all the male crew perished, including the captain, the officers, etc. Um, there was quite a bit of favoritism toward the females on when the ship hits the iceberg, and that we have to explain because we're in 1912. We were told by the feminists that women were doormats back then. I think it's a mite different. The reality is a bit different. They were favored as that ship when the ship hit the iceberg, and in fact, you may have wanted to transition at that point as a man and find some female garments, slap them on, say you're a transgendered woman, so you could get onto a lifeboat. Um, Men from first class aboard the ship died at a higher rate than women in third class accommodations. So this trumped even the class differences that were evident on ship. Now, some of the crew members, the crew members were not really clear on the guidelines. I mean, this hadn't been really anticipated well. Um, they Some crew members were filling the boats according to the guideline, women and children first. So once you've seated all the women and children that were at the rail, then you seat the males and fill up the boat. That's what they should have done. Unfortunately, others were filling the ships according to the guideline, women and children only, which means you let the lifeboats go down with available seating. That is a deadly mistake for the males at the rail. A very dumb thing. Um, but let's talk about that rule, women and children first. Now, that gives preference not only to the dependents, the children, the boys and girls. It gives preference to adult females who were supposedly doormats back then. How are they getting preference above captains of industry, of wealthy, accomplished men? How are the women getting preference in that situation? What is behind that? Now, before I discuss what was behind that, let me mention that this was not a worldwide maritime rule. That was not apparently, it's not as if every ship in the world was abiding by this guideline. They were not. Um, in fact, a cruise ship was a sort of a new development for humanity. There weren't, they didn't go back that far, only a few decades, and many parts of the world didn't have the ability to create and design cruise ships. Most of our voyages were all male. If you think of all the voyages in human history, you don't have to deal with this issue because it's all guys on board. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Columbus's ships originally had all males. All the voyages of discovery was all male. Um, so you don't have to worry. Oh, what do we do now? We've run aground. What do we do? You know, do we save anyone first or next or whatever? Um, just as a fictional example, the Pequod in Moby Dick, 50 guys on a boat. Again, 50 males on a boat. There were no females on the boat, and there are no females in the book really, except the female whales. So you have an all-male workplace, and the work was potentially grungy, also potentially dangerous. And when the ship sinks, spoiler alert, there's only one survivor. So all the other guys die. Um, so you don't have to deal with these issues. Should we give preference to one sex or the other? Now, we can start to think about why. So, this guideline was only in the minds of the officials who established the guideline. Nevertheless, that guideline probably made sense to the passengers. It probably made sense to the broader society at that time. So, it's important to understand what went into that decision. Um, that perhaps the originators of the rule did not realize, because they didn't realize it. We, from our perspective, can identify what went into that decision. Now, let's talk about a specific couple aboard Titanic. John Jacob Astor the fourth, the wealthiest person aboard the ship and the wealthiest person in the United States, and his new wife, Madeline Force Astor. Um, uh, he was a man in his 40s. She was in her late teens, early 20s. Their affair had been somewhat scandalous. He had been married to someone else and divorced her and married this teenage debutante from a nouveau riche family. Um, now they were aboard ship. They were sort of getting away from the scandal. She was 2 or 3 months pregnant, and I believe, and she was certainly pregnant, and they both knew she was pregnant. So now they come out on deck and go to the rail, and well, no, the Astors, by the way, they were old money in 1912, so they had acquired money many generations before, probably like in fur trading and commodities, things like that. And they were the Astor. That's a part of the name of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, if you have an idea, know that name. The Astor, the Astoria was from the Astor's family. Uh, so they're very wealthy, and um, he more wealthier than her and he more well known than his wife. So they get to, so he is about to get in the lifeboat um, with his wife, not as an act of cowardice. No, at that point, they think it's just a drill. He's going to get in with his wife as a protective thing. She's pregnant. He's her husband. He'll go along to be a source of support for her. But the crew members stop him and say, "Oh no, Mr. Astor, it's only women and children at this point." So he stays behind. She rows away in the lifeboat. That's a critical decision for him. He's found dead a few days later. He dies. Goes down with the ship. So he didn't make a stink about it. He didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" No, he acted honorably according to the code of the day, and he was told by the officials to stay behind, and so he did. Now it had deadly consequences. Perhaps he didn't realize it at that point. Now his wife goes back to shore, survives, and goes on to give birth to another John Jacob Astor. And I think it might have been the sixth, rather. Somehow they skipped number five. I don't know why. Maybe it's bad luck. But anyway, she had another John Jacob Astor. Now, if you think of it, in the in that, that's a possible reason why the women were saved. Um, because if you save a pregnant woman, you save two people. If you save a man, you save one person. So that's at least the fact that the women get pregnant is part of the answer, but it's not the complete answer. Because of course, how many women were pregnant, and the crew members can't determine whether a woman is pregnant or not in many cases. So, many women went to those rails who were postmenopausal. They would never get pregnant again. Others had were maybe infertile. Other women probably had the intention of never having a child. So others were lesbians and would, in that day and age, not envision having a child. So it can't be based merely on the fact that to save pregnant women. You know, that's not what the guideline is based on, I believe. But certainly the fact that the women are a different sex than the men is involved. Um, now, um, so that can't be the reason, why women are saved at a higher rate than the men. It can't be pregnancy alone. But I'll tell you what I think it is. Okay, um, and this is going to sound unusual. See, women got a blanket benefit just by virtue of being an adult female. They got a blanket benefit that applied to all women, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of whether they were pregnant or not, regardless of whether they could even get pregnant, regardless of whether they intended to get pregnant. All of which would be tough for White Star crewmen to determine in that situation, right? It's a blanket thing. It's blanket. And it's based on the fact that females are the sex that doesn't die in shipwrecks. Females are the sex that doesn't die in shipwrecks if we can prevent it. Similarly, females are the sex that doesn't die in the trenches of war because women are not our combat soldiers. At that time, they were not at all, and today play a minor role. Women are the sex that doesn't die in coal mine explosions because they are not the coal miners. Back then, or even today, they're well underrepresented as coal miners. Women are the sex that doesn't die falling off a girder at as they're building a skyscraper, because women tend not to be the iron workers. Back then, not at all. Today, rarely. Women are the sex that doesn't die prematurely, I should say. Women are the sex that doesn't die prematurely as loggers, felling giant trees, because women are not loggers. 98% of the loggers are male. Women are the sex that doesn't die. How about trimming giant trees with a chainsaw? Because tree trimmers are overwhelmingly male. Women are the sex that only dies from pregnancy and childbirth. That's the only way they're allowed to die prematurely. That's the only that's the only situation where we allow them to risk their lives prematurely before they've had the full complement of offspring. So the rule that the guidelines that applied on Titanic were related to the division of labor by sex that humanity developed over long periods of time. And what it does is it protects females from avoidable risks. It protects the females from avoidable risks. So they're protected from the risks of the job, some of these crazy jobs that men do. And they're also protected from a risk of dying from an accident like the Titanic sinking. And the men protect them at the risk of the man's life. Um, so this is part of the division of sex, and it's a division of risk between the two sexes. So the individuals that developed this rule, no doubt maritime experts, were affected by that underlying rule in humanity, that underlying division of labor by sex. So it was very easy for them to say women and children first. Very easy. They did it easily. They didn't even probably consider it deeply. But it's based on a deep thing about our species is we sort of only want the women to die in childbirth. If they must die, at least be doing this major thing, giving birth, not being on a cruise liner, you know. And so that's why the women get an added benefit. They get a blanket benefit aboard Titanic. Um, because it has nothing to do with who's brave or not. The children, you might expect that if the children were left behind as the ship sinks, they would be very afraid and screaming, and that would be horrible for the adults to witness, and it's obviously the children have more years of life to live. So, for many reasons, you put the children of males and females in the lifeboats. You don't need a woman for every child in the lifeboat. You have a White Star crewman, you have other adults on the lifeboat in the lifeboat. Um, the women are on the lifeboat not because they'd be like terribly frightened if they were aboard the ship when it sank. That's not the reason. Women are the sex that doesn't die in shipwrecks. Strangely, if we can avoid it, if we can prevent it. And in Titanic, on that evening, humans could prevent it to a large degree. So that's why, on a percentage basis, many more men died than women. And many of the women went back to shore and then subsequently gave birth. So, I don't know how many extra people we got because of that decision. I don't know that anyone has calculated that and found out how many Titanic survivors subsequently gave birth. Um, but it's sort of a blanket benefit since it also applies to women who are not going to give birth and can't give birth and can't get pregnant. Um, but um, but that also applies to women hunting deer, which is going to be an exclusively male task historically. And there's tons of 40-year-old women who could have been helpful on the deer hunt, but they're being protected from those risks of going out from the camp. It's a division of risk between the two sexes, and so it's interesting how it winds up affecting the guidelines when a ship is evacuated. It's very unusual, but um, I think very interesting. So women in the sex that doesn't die in shipwrecks, okay? We're only going to let them die in childbirth. Now it's interesting. No one stops women from getting pregnant. Nobody in any age says, "Don't get pregnant. Are you crazy? It's dangerous." That's sort of interesting. Girls in the past who had many, many babies, 6, 8, 10, 12. Now, part of that was because some of the children would die as infants. There was a high infant mortality. But, you know, the women are risking their lives every time, and no one stops them there. No one says, "Oh, get in the pregnancy lifeboat." These are people who will never get pregnant. No one says that to women because we need the babies to replace people that are dying. We really need them to reproduce. And so that we have a ton of women healthy to reproduce, we save them from the worst risks of the shipwreck. And we save them from some of the more dangerous jobs so that women risk their lives having babies. It's a division of risk between the sexes that's operating at all times and in all places in our species. So it's very interesting. Uh, now, um, you can decide whether we still follow this rule. This is a decision to be made by individuals today. Now that women have gained parity in the workaday world, they've gained equality basically with males. Um, should we not give preferences like this to females? It's an obvious preference that females enjoy. But since they've achieved equality with males, should we continue to do this? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's not many Titanics that occur. It doesn't happen a ton of times. So we're not forced to debate this monthly or yearly. But it's up to what people decide. I don't think men today are imbued with the code of going down with the ship to protect female aunts, grandmoms, and female strangers, but you have to sort of be raised with the expectation that you will do that. That's why people generally behaved when the Titanic sank. There was some cowardly behavior, like Cal in the movie, forcing his way onto a lifeboat, coercing his way, I guess by with at gunpoint onto a lifeboat. But most people behaved, and the men didn't throw the women out of the way usually to get on those lifeboats. You have to raise the males according to a code, and they have to agree with that. So they just apply it in a situation where they're afraid. So I don't know that we're doing that with men today. You so that's one interesting thing. Now, so this was a balancing of the risks between the sexes that helped our species survive. The Titanic gives you a little glimpse of that. Obviously, it's more that was uncommon. Mostly the balancing of the risk is done with our division of work between the two sexes, and that helps us survive. So, um, but now, has the Titanic recurred? Has it happened again? Well, I think it has. No one says it's going to happen on a cruise ship the next time. No one is guaranteed that. Now, when Sully Sullenberger's plane came down in the Hudson, you remember that, and uh, there was a bird strike, and he had to take it down into the Hudson. The crew acted tremendously, but the fuselage was filling with water, and they had to evacuate people onto the wings, men, women, and children. A voice was heard to say, women and children first. Now, that was not a crew member's voice, and I don't have absolute proof that that actually occurred. But I did hear in the early days that a voice was heard to say that. But of course, you can't evacuate an airplane on that basis, according to that guideline. You got to evacuate whoever is near the door. Everybody's got to keep moving out the door, right? So none of the crew were operating according to that guideline. You know? So that was not a recurrence of the Titanic, and everybody survived that plane crash. Um, but now there has been a situation which was the second coming of Titanic, and it's called Ukraine. Consider as if Ukraine is a boat, a big ocean liner that has, I don't know, 20, 30 million people on it, men, women, children. Russian troops are massing at the borders 3 years ago. Everybody is saying, even expert people are saying, the Ukrainians have no chance. The Russian troops are going to just sweep in, kill Zelensky, overthrow the government, establish Russian control and dominance, etc., etc. So, in that desperate situation, the Ukrainians implemented a simple rule. Men from 18 to 60 could not leave. They were prohibited from leaving Ukraine. Women could stay or go according to their preferences. That's not equal. That's not equal. Let's be real here. That is not equal. I think that's acceptable. And I didn't hear too many complaints, even from feminists. They didn't say, wait, that's not fair. Don't let women go also, No. Now, so what that did is those men, 18 to 60, were expected to serve in the army. And most of Ukrainian soldiers are male. Some are female. Women could leave. These were women who had babies or maybe did not. They might have been single women. And they went to European countries, Poland or France or wherever, came to the US. Some had children, brought their children with them. That's fine. There was no complaint. But that is a special benefit for the Ukrainian females that the males did not enjoy. So saying we're equal is fine, okay? But it's equal smequal, okay? We're still two different sexes, fundamentally different because of our evolutionary history and because of our different reproductive organs. So, and sometimes you see a second Titanic. Now, the rules are not, um, some women stayed, and are drone operators now. They're in the army. But that's a free choice. The guys didn't get that same free choice, you know. Um, so we actually have had a second Titanic. Ukraine was sinking, and they had to develop a rule. How do you evacuate Ukraine? On what basis? The men can't leave, they stay behind. The women are able to get in the lifeboats and get away. So that applied to all adult males and females. There were some exceptions. And I don't think the rule is in place today necessarily, but um, it's very revealing. These things recur, So it's good to understand what is it based on. What's the basis? And it's based on the balancing of risk between males and females. That's what it's based on. So let me look here and let's see if I. So women tend to only die prematurely from pregnancy and childbirth. So they might die having their first baby, or their second baby, or their third baby. So all the babies that they might be destined to have had they lived do not come into existence. So we suffer a hit there in terms of population when that occurs. So we don't want that to happen often. But at least women are doing what they uniquely do, getting pregnant and giving birth. They're not doing something stupid like a deer hunt. or stupid like taking an ocean cruise and dying before they have their full allotment of babies, you know. So humanity has had to make these decisions and to divide the risk between the sexes. So I'll have more to say about that and actually talk about the division of labor in our species everywhere, everywhere on Earth. Um, I think that's about it. Um, yeah, that's about it. So another step in our adventure, our interesting adventure about the sexes. So if you like this, hit the like button or subscribe because there's going to be more of the same. It never ends. The how interesting the two sexes are, particularly women. It just never ends. There's no end to it, and there'll be more up ahead. So over and out.